Hey, Detoxers. Welcome to a special episode of the Disinfo Detox. Today, I am joined by author Lisa Ekman, who just published a very interesting book I cannot wait to talk about, titled Deprogramming Democrats and Uneducating the Elites. Lisa Ekman, welcome to the Disinfo Detox.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here, Nolan.
Yeah, let's start in the beginning because your book it starts out with you kind of discussing how you didn't know where this story began, but tell us a little bit about why um, you talk about the Democrats like they're a cult and how you found yourself in what you perceived as a cult.
Sure. So I think it evolved. I grew up in a family that was JFK Democrats, very liberal, meaning they believed in liberty and freedom and the basics of our Constitution. And over time, I saw the Democratic Party change significantly. Like many people, I think who have, and I will say I'm an independent now. I don't consider myself a Republican. I'm going to vote for the candidate who I believe best reflects our Constitution and protects our constitutional rights, just so that the audience understands that. But what I saw happening, and it began kind of with political correctness as the first thing, is moving away from sort of inclusivity and moving toward a very rigid set of beliefs, which I view and talk about in the book as ideological conformity. And if you didn't conform with those exact ideas, you started to get what I would say is ostracized or sort of excommunicated from the cult. And a lot of people say to me, "Well, Lisa, who's the charismatic leader? Cults always have charismatic leaders." And after being through, sitting through 4 years of a Biden administration, I'm not sure we could say they had a very charismatic leader there. But what it is that it is not about a particular person. It's that they worship authority and they idolize the expert. And so that if you vary from what the overarching narrative of the experts and the government is, then you are no longer considered part of the cult. And can talk about the way in which that evolved more. But I started to see that more and more, and I started to see them move further and further away from the ideals of actual inclusivity, inclusivity of belief, and being welcomed, and more towards the exclusion and cancel culture, and away from really those fundamental principles like freedom of speech, which I consider myself a freedom of speech and really a First Amendment absolutist, because if we lose those rights, all the rest of our rights are gone as well. And as I saw that, that's how I needed to deprogram myself out of the cult.
Okay, and I want to talk about that process, but let's unpack that a little more. So you're mentioning that there's pressure for ideological conformity, and you mentioned some of the areas like free speech, but you have some specific examples of where you saw Democrats or liberals pressuring for ideological conformity.
Sure. I think one would be around the conversations around gender and what I would call gender ideology. I think it is fair, and my opinion would be that there are two sexes, and you can express yourself as a personality with any way you want to. And I think any adult should be allowed to dress how they want, should be allowed to love who they want and marry who they want. But I also believe that if you, as a person, believe because of science or because of um, your religion that there is a man and a woman, you are allowed to have those views, and you should be able to speak. And this gets back to the free speech piece as well. In a way that reflects that without facing consequences for that illegally or in other ways. And you cannot have that opinion and be a member of the progressive cult, as I call it.
Yeah, and so just to be clear, I think I understood this correctly. You're saying that essentially, it's not even necessarily that you agree or disagree with kind of the dominant thinking of liberals and Democrats on the issue of gender. It's the fact that you felt like there's not an opportunity to actually talk about it if people do disagree with it. Do I have that correct?
No, I personally believe that people should be able to express them how they are, but I do not believe that you become a woman if you are born biologically a male by how you dress or the hormones that you take. You're still a man, And there are certain things that women are women's rights that we fought for that should be protected. I don't think we should discriminate against someone because of how they dress or what cosmetic procedures or what hormones they take. But at the same time, I don't think we should be letting them into women's spaces or women's sports. And I definitely don't think we should be talking to children about these ideas that not everyone agrees on are actual reality.
So, so I get the a difference of opinion with, especially a lot of the mainstream Democrats on that issue. But what I'm trying to drill down on is your frustration with the Democrats, the fact that like they wouldn't allow you to express an opinion like that, or that they just don't share that opinion.
It's that they wouldn't allow me to express an opinion like that and actually would actually call me names for doing so without being allowed to express that opinion. And there was a poll that was taken, I think it was in 2022, Nolan, where up to 50, just under 50% of Democrats said that someone should be thrown in jail. It should be considered a crime to misgender someone. Now, I disagree with them about that. I believe when you call a someone who was born a biological male a female, you are misgendering them, as opposed to vice versa. But it's to the point where half of the people, and those tend to be the loudest, and they're the ones screaming on social media, say you should, young people especially, you should get thrown in jail for doing that to someone. And so that's where you start you really losing me. And I think what has happened is that the party has started to cater more to those people on the far end who would say that. And then I also think it's the fact that people had started trying to get people canceled and deplatformed and debanked for that as well. And while I do believe that just because you have a right to say something under the First Amendment, it protects your right to say it, doesn't mean you're immune from the consequences of what you actually say, whether that be at your job or whether that be if you are, defrauding or committing libel or that kind of thing, that there are legal consequences, can be legal consequences as well. But it's just that sort of lack of an ability to express that opinion and still be considered sort of one of the group that really made it challenging for me to stay a member of the Democratic Party.
So, so with that in mind, what do you say to folks who say, let's say they agree with everything you just said, but they also point out that the Trump administration right now is essentially putting limits on whether or not schools can talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, a lot of the positions you just disagreed with and said you weren't allowed to give your opinion on. Now there's people who disagree with you, and they're not allowed to give their opinion on those things if they want federal funding per se, or what do when we talk about sort of the demonization or canceling of another side of the Trump administration has been going after people who ideologically disagree with them, particularly on the issue of Israel. So is it really a Democrat issue, or is this a cultural problem we have in this country?
So I think there's a lot that you just packed into that one question, Nolan. So let me try to say, first of all, I believe that there's a difference between what an individual is allowed to say and then what an individual might be allowed to say in the context of the fact that the federal government is paying for them to say it. And so when it comes to schools, I think we have a particular need to take sort of what I would call indoctrination out of the schools. And I think that um, when you have schools should be teaching, for the most part, facts. Schools should be teaching things that, for example, science supports with data and evidence. And schools shouldn't be teaching things that, for example, maybe half of the country disagrees with and is not supported by scientific evidence. And I'm not here to, just to be clear, to defend the Trump administration on every policy that they have. I think with putting gender aside and talking about the diversity, equity, and inclusion aspect of it, I think that discrimination is discrimination, and whether that happens towards a group that has been what you might consider historically oppressed or not, it's still discrimination. And the Supreme Court has been pretty clear that, for example, in college admissions, considering race, for example, in any way is actually discrimination under the 14th Amendment. And that it has to be completely colorblind. Earlier Supreme Court decisions said you can't have quotas, right? But there was a group of Asian students who sued, and I'm trying to remember the name of the case at the moment.
That was
Maybe
the Harvard case you're
the
talking.
Harvard case, yeah, in which they said, you know what, you can't consider it at all because, and I think this is a backlash against what we saw as something going too far in discriminating against Asian and white people. And I think part of is is happening is that when you go too far in one direction, you sometimes see an overcorrection back in the other direction. Um, and we were moving so far away from where sort of Martin Luther King Jr.'s, you know, I want people to be judged on the content of their character, that we were seeing moving back towards that. And I think the other thing the Supreme Court has been pretty clear about is that the federal government has a pretty wide berth to use the power of the purse. In other words, you don't necessarily have to do what we're saying here, but if you're taking our money, you do, as long as it doesn't run afoul of things like the 14th Amendment guarantee to equal protection under the law.
Yeah, and I see that, and I think I would quibble a little bit on how clear the Supreme Court has been. I mean, you can throughout its whole history, it's gone back and forth on this issue, whether it be supporting, say, segregation and with Plessy v. Ferguson, then overthrowing it in the 50s, and then even in the 2003, the Supreme Court said you can use race for purposes of diversity, but can't have quotas. So they've always sort of been, I think, wishy washy on that. And then to your point though about kind of how you want to get indoctrination and sciences out of school, I think this is always, you know, a problem that whether you're right, left, or center, people have. I mean, there's a case to make that, like, you know, the the forced teaching of certain histories is very much in itself an indoctrination if you leave out other content. And I would say just that to be fair to the issue of gender and sex, I think there's been pretty substantive scientific and social science research to clarify what is sex and what is gender, and how those two differ. So I think it's a well accepted field. It's not fringe at this point. But I want to go back to something you said though in there about the power of the purse, the federal government. I guess what I'm failing to see, and I agree with you that historically liberals and conservatives have used the power of the purse. You can go back and look at, like, you know, LBJ was really good at using the power of the purse to get a liberal agenda forward. Reagan certainly was in the 80s for a conservative agenda. My question to you, though, is not about kind of picking a side between Democrats or Republicans. My point is that when Democrats were doing it in your book, you seemed very frustrated with it, and you make the case why. But how come when Republicans are doing the same thing, isn't it kind of the same, like, forced coercion through federal government? Doesn't that bother you as much? That it both kind of go against the principles you're talking about free expression. We can say what we want, do what we want, let the people decide. It seems like both sides, when getting power, utilize it to try and control. But what do you say to that?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that both sides use whatever power the other side uses as well. You know, I'll go back to something that I said, though, Nolan, before, and that is I think we had moved so far in one direction, we may see a little bit of an overcorrection. But I also think, yeah, I think we had gotten to a point in talking to young people where it is so one-sided. You know, I talked to some young folks who can't even tell me what the amendments to the Bill of Rights are, what our Constitution says, how we were founded. They have been, we've had and I will get to this because I think it's important. I will say, you know, I focus mainly on the Democrats in the book because that's my experience. You know, that is what I know. But I also will say that I'm an independent, and I consider the establishment, sort of the political establishment, which I saw change a lot while I was in Washington for 20 years in a very negative way, as sort of two wings of the same bird that sort of flap. and kind of make it look like we have an illusion of choice when they really are just protecting their own money and power, and the power of the lobbyists and the power of the oligarchs and the corporations, and the donors. But like I say, I think what we have now is that over 90% of professors at colleges are Democrats. 95% of their donations go to Democrats. Most of all, and those are the people who are training the people who are teaching our children. And a lot of that is grounded in what started out as critical theory and then became critical legal theory and then turned into critical race theory, which underpinning it is an assumption that our institutions are inherently bad and need to be deconstructed and destroyed. And the way that you can do that is by educating people to believe those things. So when I, for example, would say, what I asked someone what the Fourth Amendment was, and a young person couldn't answer that question. Or can you tell me about, for example, what is the Bolshevik Revolution? What was it? And how many people died during it? And they have no answer to that, but they can tell you all about how awful Christopher Columbus was and the genocide that happened here on American soil. There's a problem in our schools in that we're teaching very one-sided history. I'm not saying that the other side won't overcorrect, but I do think that we that's really the answer that I give to
Yeah,
you.
yeah, no, and I think that's really fair, particularly in the education front. I've been critical of that as well. We have these things called diversity statements, but they've largely operated as homogeneity statements. And like even earlier, you and I were kind of going back and forth a little bit on the issues of like gender and sex, for example. Those kind of debates rarely happen in academia. Liberal professors argue against like a straw man conservative, and on conservative media they argue against a straw man liberal professor, and I think that's where the nation loses, right? Is let the nation see those debates in real time from people who are up to date on the topic and fall wherever they may, but we don't really have a lot of spaces for that. So I agree with you on that. Was also thinking as you were talking there about how in your book you mentioned how there's kind of these events that make you attuned to the fact that you're into what you see as a cult, right? This kind of progressive cult, as you call it. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the influence that like the COVID-19 pandemic had on kind of your thinking, because that was such a pivotal event. I think an ugly side of the American political system and its parties really came out during that moment. But I kind of wonder what your experience was, given where you ended up.
So for me, it was very pivotal in my awakening. There were a couple of things that happened, and I would like to relate quickly a story that happened a few years before that because it is very important to how it affected me. I lost both my parents. My dad passed in 2014 and my mom in 2016. And while my dad had some catastrophic complications from surgery, my mom was taking care of him, and she had MS and she was his main caregiver. And while she was doing that, she developed stage 4 of an extremely aggressive cancer, and was given the get your affairs in order speech. You may have a couple of months to live. And she said, Lisa, I'm going to do traditional treatment, but I also will do anything else I can to improve my odds, because the 5-year survival rate at her stage, at her age, was about 6% for the cancer that she was diagnosed with. So I did a bunch of research and found a lot of things can really help that really have nothing to do with traditional medical care, but it's about your diet. It's about the toxins you expose your body to. And we got her to a naturopath. We got her changed her diet, everything she put in and on her body, cleaned her home with, worked on dealing with stress to detoxify. And she had surgery and then started a round of 6 chemo treatments. And by chemo treatment 3, she was cancer free, completely gone. And it was all the result of these other things. And so the research that I did, Nolan, started to kind of give me questions about our regulatory agencies that work on health. And these were the very agencies that I had spent at that point 15, 16 years working with. So she was cancer free for 2 years, had a small growth come back, took 1 chemo treatment, and chemo fried her kidneys. And so she died from chemotherapy poisoning, although her death would be called a cancer death. And so this raised a lot of questions for me about the health advice we get, about the agencies, and about who they were really serving. But I had to go back to work. So I kind of put a pinhole in that and couldn't think about that. Flash forward, I had actually decided to retire due to the other things going on in DC on March 31st of 2020, which, if you can recall back, we were just after 2 weeks to flatten the curve right then on COVID. And a lot of the advice that was being given to us did not make any sense to me based on all that research I had done to try to help my mom. And I'll use this as one example because the science on this is 100% clear. And if you go to the NIH website, you will find it all over the place that vitamin D is one of the most important things that you can do to help strengthen your immune system. And this is not just in relation to COVID, it's just in relation to everything. And if you recall, at the very beginning of the pandemic, you couldn't leave your house. Even if you had a backyard that no one else could get into, you were not supposed to go outside. And the number one way to get vitamin D is sun. So this didn't make any sense to me. And then they came out with the 6-foot social
Look,
distancing.
Lisa, sorry to interrupt you. Just real quick, because I'm not familiar with that. I was in California. We had lockdowns, but we were allowed to go outside. We weren't allowed to go into businesses and congregate with people.
You were
Where did you have? I'm just asking. Where was that?
Washington, D.C., if you were not essential, you were told stay inside, don't go outside. And I mean, they literally locked down and closed playgrounds. You were not supposed to leave your house unless you were an essential worker. Um, and then the 6-foot social distancing came out. And I said, well, from a common sense perspective, obviously, maybe if you stay farther away from someone, you're less likely to transmit or infect someone. But again, I looked for the science and I couldn't find it. And it has since come out. Anthony Fauci admitted in a Senate hearing that, there was no science behind it. It just sort of appeared and we went with it. Well, like I said, from a common sense perspective.
Sorry, Lisa, real quick, but I believe if I remember that correctly from Fauci, and believe me, there's a lot of critiques with Fauci I want to get into with you, but I believe the conventional wisdom was the conventional thinking among scientists was something like 14 feet, but Fauci went for like the 6 feet, and that was the part that had no logic. Like he picked a
There
random
is
number.
actually there's like no science to back up the fact that any distance will keep you safe. Actually, if you go back and actually look for the scientific data and evidence, if you cough, it could be 30 feet away. It's just sort of like, but to Nolan, the real point of it is that these things didn't make sense, and I couldn't find data and evidence to support them. Even if it was 14 feet, 6 feet didn't make any sense. And so I said, well, okay. And then we're having these conversations, and then I started to see censorship happen. I started to see people who were raising questions, and legitimate questions, in my opinion, being censored and shut down. And some of the natural health practitioners I had started to follow after doing the research with my mom were among the quote unquote disinformation dozen who, for saying things like maybe get some sun, maybe, do this. And then I saw the Great Barrington Declaration coming out with thousands of scientists and researchers and doctors saying, we should take an approach to protect the most vulnerable, just like we almost always do. And there was no public discussion of this at all. And in fact, if it got discussed, it was shut down. And so it started to raise some real questions to me. I understand the sort of instinct that in a situation like this where people's lives may be at risk, to err on the side of caution. But you can't have credibility as a scientist, in my mind, and an expert if you're basing this on common sense or my best guess, which we actually had some of our officials saying, well, it was our best guess at the time. And really, the point I would raise now is that tens of thousands of people lost their businesses. Children lost years of development that will never come back. We had to change developmental milestones for young children because they didn't see people's mouths. They couldn't learn to talk. They didn't get the social skills, all the things. So while, I didn't I was very scared at first, and I didn't want to kill grandma, and I wanted to protect my neighbor. But I also we shut down the world over not data and evidence. And I would question what we actually did shut it down for, but not over data and evidence. And so that was sort of what happened. And then my boyfriend at the time, who's my partner now, asked me a question. Because I said to him, I can't believe the people that I've worked with, the people that these agencies I worked with would do this to us without data and evidence. And he said to me, Lisa, if they'll poison our water, what won't they do? And I already believed that they do poison our water, that fluoride in our water is, and they have since come out with studies that show it lowers IQ points in children, and that it isn't very effective for teeth. And there are all sorts of other things about our water treatment. Um, and so I
Lisa,
couldn't reconcile those two things. Yes, Nolan.
I want to jump into just a couple of things. I mean, the fluoride thing I think is still debatable, but something else you said earlier that I think was important, and I wanted to swing back to. The reason why I asked about COVID, because I think I share this with you, and I don't necessarily think it's the lies per se. I think it's the smugness so that you're speaking to, and I agree with you if that is what you're speaking to. Like also in the early on in the pandemic, for example, the some of the science incorrectly, or some of the interpretation of the science incorrectly concluded we had to like wash our vegetables. You remember that? And they went back on that, but nobody felt like we were being bamboozled. It wasn't like a big deal. I think the game changed when Fauci was saying things like, first he said you didn't need to wear masks, then he said you do need to wear masks. When he was questioned about it, he said, well, I was afraid if I said that you had to wear masks, there'd be a run on masks, we wouldn't have them for frontline workers. Or he kept changing the percentage of people who need to get vaccinated for immunity, right? And he later on said he was afraid of doing too high of a number because people wouldn't feel like we'd be able to achieve it. I also have him on video in 2021 telling, this is when they were afraid that the black community wouldn't take the vaccine. He had a PBS film crew film him through this black community where he was telling people you won't have any symptoms if you get vaccinated, right? And we know people got vaccinated, got COVID, got symptoms. So I think it's not necessarily you get things wrong like the washing the vegetables. I think it was the smugness that it was said if you question Anthony Fauci, you're questioning the science. But this is why I want to go back and to something you said earlier. You said the science was wrong. I don't necessarily think the science or scientists were wrong. I think the people in government who were interpreting the science didn't understand what they were interpreting, and I think they did it with a smug attitude. And when there were sometimes inconsistencies or inaccuracies, the public was like, how dare you tell me what to do when you don't know what you're doing? So I don't know, is it really a rejection of science, or is it these kind of governmental officials?
I think I think a lot in both columns, Nolan. I will say that I think they very much overestimated, in part based on modeling out of the UK, I think, what the actual infection rate was, to say that it was way worse than the flu. And if you look at the CDC statistics, it's not. And so the science was based on modeling was wrong. And then I think what you said about, Anthony Fauci changing the thing about masks and then the 6 foot social distancing only made it worse. It's like, and I think the thing that I was starting to get to me and a lot of people, and I still feel like we have never had a reconciling of what happened to make sure it's not going to happen again. We're said it's over, don't worry about it. But if we were to have another outbreak of something, how sure are you, Nolan, that it would be handled better, and we wouldn't see that same smugness now with different characters because we've moved on with different people in those positions. But I think that's part of what the challenge is. When we raised questions, we were told we were anti-science. We were told we're bad people, that we want to kill grandma, that all of those things. And we've never really had public conversations about how does the law need to be changed to prevent this from happening again, and how can we make sure that we do protect the vulnerable without causing all these unneeded catastrophic consequences for both children, adults, and then also our economy, because the amount of money we printed during COVID certainly devalued the dollar and led to a lot of the inflation issues that we face as Americans today.
Yeah, and that's I think what you said there is really powerful, and I think there's a lot of people in your shoes who otherwise would have supported the Democratic Party, otherwise been supportive of the scientific community and education community, but they do feel like they've been abused and ignored, as you just described there, and lied to. And I also think, you mentioned this earlier about small businesses closing. A lot of other countries were able to pull together their tax dollars to keep people afloat, pay their rent, pay their wages while there was a shutdown. And that's really, if the modeling said, if you actually did a real shutdown, like 2 to 3 weeks, then you could kill the curve. We didn't do that. We still allowed some international travel. We allowed frontline workers. So when people say the shutdown did or didn't work, I say we never really did the shutdown. We kind of half did a shutdown, which is why it could never really succeed in that. But I think the point you're making about the ways in which people needed money during the pandemic, and they're being told by the party like, "Oh, you're just anti-science. We have to shut down." I don't think any of that stuff played well. So I think your book is a fascinating look at people's journey through a very critical time period. Where can folks go to follow more of your work and get the book if they want to pick it up?
My book is available on Amazon. It is also available at Barnes and Noble, and you can check out my website at deprogrammingdemocrats.com.
All right, Lisa Ekman, thank you so much for coming on the Disinfo Detox. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Nolan.
Thank you. And thank you, Detoxers. We'll see you next time.